Let me ask you a question. What is your relationship with anger? And before answering, take a second to really think about it. Do you know your triggers? Are you aware of how you usually react with others? If so, would you consider yourself the type to lash out? Would you typically go cry in a corner? Or maybe you're like me, where you'll keep it bottled in until someone offers you a TED Talk. Now, I don't really like to be labeled as angry, but let me share with you how harnessing this powerful emotion and using it as an asset has led to some of the most incredible moments of my life. Now, full transparency, this is not a fairy tale. However, there is a good ending. And although I can remember the story as if it were yesterday, I want you to use your imagination to imagine me as an 8-year-old boy. And it shouldn't be hard. I pretty much look the same. It's a few feet shorter, less facial hair, same size head. And if you swap out the suit for some pajamas, you pretty much have the vision. Now, on this night that we're going to discuss, I laid in the bed pretending to be asleep until I heard a noise. It sounded like papers ruffling. And I was an observant child, AKA nosy, but overall pretty introverted, a gifted student from a 2-parent household and raised in a deep Christian belief to love thy neighbor, turn all 4 cheeks, and most importantly, to mind my business. But on this night, none of that matters. I'd gotten accustomed to hearing my parents host card parties. So to hear a loud noise or to hear the distinct sound of a card hitting a glass table was nothing new to me. However, on this night, something was off. This didn't sound like a competitive spades game, and the emotion in this man's voice was filled with so much anger that it somehow traveled through the walls and up my spine. And that brought me to attention. I paused my thoughts on which Power Ranger I wanted to be and started to make my way down the hall. And all I could hear was thump, thump, thump. And no, there wasn't the sound of my footsteps on the hardwood floor, but rather a violent noise that I heard from the other room that encouraged me to pick up the pace. And as I came around the corner, what I saw made me feel that I arrived in perfect timing. And I wedged myself in between 2 adults in an attempt to get them to stop fighting. Now, in hindsight, I don't know how effective I expected to be as an 8-year-old. But I did know that my intentions were good, and if I was there, no one would do anything to put me in harm's way. Or at least I thought. And the room went silent. So in my mind, I did it. I brought peace. It took me a few seconds to really process what was transpiring. As my brain started to sort through the fog that I now recognize as shock, I found myself face to face with the barrel of a gun. And as I continued to process what was taking place, the man with the gun smirked and repeatedly taunted me by asking, "Do you think you're grown? Do you think you're grown? Do you think you're grown?" And no matter how many times he asked, I couldn't find an answer. I was frozen, physically, mentally, and for just a second, emotionally. But as I started to ruffle through my thoughts, such as questioning, am I about to die? And asking myself, how could someone that I love so much treat me so poorly? I started to develop this fire in my belly. And it came with what felt like superpowers. It increased my heart rate. I somehow had an enhanced sight of sight, sound, maybe even strength. But this was no power. This was just my first time learning to hate someone. And while I would love to tell you that this newfound energy gave me the ability to roundhouse kick the gun out of the man's hands, the truth is, I just stared. No words, no movements, no tears, just silence. And after what felt like an eternity, The man lowered the gun, apologized, and left abruptly. But in my mind, that moment never ended. And so later that night, as I attempted to go to sleep with my mother rubbing my back, as I sniffled and wiped away what felt like an endless river of tears, I made a promise to myself that no matter how confused or petrified that I may be, that never again would I allow anyone or anything to ever force me to freeze in fear. And I kept that promise to myself for a while. Whenever I encountered something I felt was insurmountable, I'd dig deep to revisit that moment, to find that sense of strength and safety that I needed to get through every situation. And it served me well. For over 20 years, I used this as a blanket of safety of sorts, and it got me through some really tough times, such as a woman terminating a pregnancy because I couldn't provide for a child at the time, or losing almost 25 friends and family members to gun violence before the age of 25. And while that's a lot to process, I carried it in public as if nothing ever bothered me. I felt that my ability to bury my emotions was an effective form of anger management, because you wouldn't see me walking around with some big neon chip on my shoulder, nor would you find someone who considered me a hothead. But underneath it all, I struggled to untangle my emotions, and it was a slow and silent process. And the more comfortable I got with it, the more calculating and numb I became. And like most young men, the less emotion I showed, the more pride I took. And that worked for me up until the day that it didn't. My facade stood tall until the day I witnessed my childhood friend murdered on social media. And my friend was a good man. He was a father, an aspiring chef, who was murdered My friend was gunned down in the case of mistaken identity as he celebrated his wedding anniversary. And as the insensitive commentary and the disturbing images circulated, I found myself sick to my stomach. I was driving, so I pulled over and prepared to vomit everything I'd ever eaten. But what came out was everything I'd ever felt. Gut-wrenching, blood-curdling cries, shrieks that strained my vocal cords as I fell to my knees in the middle of a parking lot. And thankfully, I had a beautiful woman there with me, who's now my wife, who helped me to pick up the pieces of a broken man. And as I struggled to regain my composure, I took a deep breath and something unexpected took place. I could no longer find the energy to be angry. Now, I was sad, distraught, probably on the brink of depression. But for the first time that I can remember, that internal inferno that I had dug for so many times as a renewable source of energy was no longer there. And that should have been a silver lining, because I wasn't frozen in anger, but truth being told, I'd become so reliant on it that I didn't know how to operate without it. And anyone around me could see that I was just scared, but not scared to the point that I couldn't keep my promise to myself. And so that night, just like in any other situation, I wiped my tears, I stood tall. I put on my hoodie, I stared into the mirror for what felt like forever, and decided that I was going to go do something to make my childhood friend proud. I enrolled in therapy, and it was actually very helpful. It helped me to learn that anger was never really my source of strength. Anger was simply a reminder that I've been pushed past my personal boundaries. And by personal, I mean internal. So while it's not fair to blame others for making you angry, it's a very effective method to use. It's taking anger and using it as a trail of breadcrumbs to figure out what's really bothering you. And while that primary emotion may be hard to find and even more difficult to face, it's very much worth the search. And in my case of coming face to face with my pain, I learned that that ball of fire that I was so dependent on was really just a reaction to fear. A fear that started the night that my childhood hero pointed a gun at me. And it started to splinter and had spinoffs and everything. Turned into a fear of danger, a fear of becoming a statistic, fear of trusting authority. And I thought that this newfound self-awareness would lead me down some free path of knowledge, and what it turned into was me becoming a police officer somehow. And as much as I laughed to myself about making that decision, it honestly was one of the best decisions that I've ever made, because I learned to see the world in a different way. And like most other good officers, I often found that when I had these great concepts, that my hands were proverbially tied behind my back. And although I saw a lot of things that upset me, one thing that really stood out was seeing young people throw their lives away in anger. Because while the rest of the world wrote them off as lost causes, I saw through all the fighting and the yelling, and I could see that they were just scared. And that was a pain that I knew all too well. That was a fear that I lived with for much too long not to recognize it. And so I started to think, what if this is my ability to truly protect and serve? So after going back and forth, I came up with the idea that I would connect with troubled teens by talking to them about money. I mean, you have to offer them something, right? And even if people don't like the police, everybody likes money. And so with that, I began to develop these relationships, and it was honestly one of the most joyful times of my life. And by giving to them, I inadvertently given myself the gift. See, I didn't realize it, but by helping these young men and women confront their fears, I'd somehow become the beacon of safety and guidance that I wished that I had as a child. And that led me to something else. I'd redeveloped this fire in my belly, but now it was very different, much more focused, a lot more constructive, and it felt like purpose. And the more I explored that purpose, the more I realized that there was one last thing that I needed to do. I needed to say goodbye to the little boy. And while letting go of those memories was not an overnight process, it is a time of my life that I remember fondly. Because by exchanging love in the place of that fear, I found a much more powerful energy source, and it's helped me to grow exponentially, both personally and professionally. And while I didn't become a Power Ranger, at least not yet, I think that the 8-year-old boy will be very proud of the man that I've morphed into. I've grown a few feet, which always helps. I've accomplished everything he could dream of and then more. And by sharing his story, I've inspired others to repurpose their pain and do something positive, including the man that pointed the gun at me. That's how I used anger to bring my life full circle. So with that, I leave you with this question. What are you going to do to use your anger as an asset? Thank you.